Hello and welcome to my channel. So today I want to talk about a book that was a kind of foundational book for me, a formative book for me. And it's a book that I first read when I was about 12. And it's not really a book for a 12-year-old, but it's a book that my mum gave to me. And there's a story attached to why she gave me this book. But the book in question, this formative foundational book, is Night Shift by Stephen King. Now, when I was growing up, my mum essentially likes two types of books. So, and both the types of books she likes are kind of on opposite ends of the spectrum. So she really likes historical family sagas, preferably about working class people. So she really likes Catherine Cookson, and she likes the Call the Midwife books. So books like that. She would read a lot of books like that. But on the other hand, she would also read a lot of incredibly violent, grisly horror books. And this was when I was growing up, so it was primarily, so it was the 1990s. So the books that she had were mostly from the 70s and 80s. So it was that golden age of horror and pulp horror. So she would have books by James Herbert, Shaun Hutson, Richard Lehman, Graham Masterton, and lots of names that escape me now. But it was that era for really lurid, trashy, terrifying paperback horror with those iconic covers. And they were inescapable. So as a child, you would wander from room to room, and there would be these books. And the Catherine Cookson books and the historical fiction books and the family saga book didn't really appeal to me too much. But the horror books I found myself oddly transfixed by. You would see those covers. You would see books like Spawn by Shaun Hutson, and you would see books like Haunted by James Herbert. Or all of the Stephen King books, those terrifying covers, so Pet Sematary and Christine and It. And I would be fascinated by them, and I'd pick them up, and I'd gaze at the covers, and I would read the blurbs on the back, and I would thumb through the pages of them. And oftentimes, because my parents didn't drive, when we went on holiday, they tended to be coach trips around the UK, so coach trips to different places in the UK. So during the coach trips, I'd ask my mum, what book are you reading, and what's it about? And my mum would give me the kind of PG version of what the book was about. So she'd be telling me like a sanitized version of what It was about, or a sanitized version of what the Manitou was about. And I would just be, conjuring these stories up in my brain, envisioning them like little films in my imagination. And so I was fascinated by them. I was becoming fascinated by horror, fascinated by the kind of that climate of fear, of being that safe space that horror provides, of being able to explore fears that you felt, and discomfort that you felt, and anxieties that you felt. And so I think my mum got so kind of worn down with me constantly asking what these books were about, and can I read these books, and can I have one of these books, that when I was 12, which she must have thought was a mature enough age by that point, that she gifted me this copy of Night Shift, which is her copy of Night Shift. And this is a 1984 UK edition of Night Shift, of a book of short stories by Stephen King, originally published in 1978. And I must have read and reread this. Around the same time, she actually gave me a novelization of the film The Brood by David Cronenberg, which I think Cronenberg wrote himself, or it might have used a ghostwriter that was uncredited, I'm not sure. But I remember reading this and The Brood, and I don't have that copy of The Brood anymore. I'm very disappointed I don't have it. But I took this with me when I left home. So I've always had this copy of Night Shift that my mum gave me. And I read it and reread it, and I still read it to this day. And this has some of the absolute best early writing by Stephen King, and it's very damaged now. It's very old. It's very battered. Most of this damage was probably my mum's damage. My mum doesn't treat her books as precious objects like I do, And when I started reading this, at some point, I'd penciled little ticks next to the stories that I read, because I must have read it out of order, which is a very on-brand thing for the child version of me to have done. Is just to pick a story that sounds interesting and read it in a completely random order, rather than start at the beginning and work your way through to the end. But over time, I'd eventually read all of the stories. And to this day, this has some of the key Stephen King short stories. It has some of the most famous Stephen King short stories. So just looking through it, right away, the Mangler. This has the Mangler, which was turned into a film by Tobe Hooper, who directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre films, or the first two Texas Chainsaw Massacre films, and directed films like Poltergeist, and did the TV version of Salem's Lot, which is excellent. It might be my favourite thing Tobe Hooper has directed. But he did a version of The Mangler, which doesn't have a lot of fans, but I think is quite a fun film. And The Mangler is about a haunted industrial laundry press. It's one of those high-concept Stephen King stories where some inanimate object has become possessed, and some inanimate object is that you would never think could be terrifying, because just the reality of it, you could easily avoid it if you wanted to. But Stephen King always finds something in these things that is profoundly terrifying, and always finds a way to contrives a way that people are going to get destroyed by this object. So it's got the Mangler is in this. Sometimes They Come Back is in this, which was turned into a television film in the late 80s or early 90s. And that's one that has those classic Stephen King themes, in that it's about a kind of a struggling writer / school teacher who is looking back on a violent incident that happened to them when they were a child in the 1950s. So it's got all those the classic King iconography, the sort of the self-insert character, the 50s nostalgia, the attempt to make right a terrible wrong. It's got all the classic King elements, and that's a really great story. The Lawnmower Man is in this, which was turned into a film that has absolutely nothing to do with the story. King's The Lawnmower Man is about a kind of mad, possessed gardener who follows behind his sentient lawnmower, eating grass and crawling around on the grass naked. It's a really bizarre story and a lot of fun, and weirdly disturbing. But it was turned into this film, which is a kind of it's more of a rip-off of Flowers for Algernon, with really pioneering but now very primitive CGI. I think it came out in 1991 or 1992. And it was so unfaithful that I think King sued to have his name taken off it. But King's The Lawnmower Man is quite an experience on its own. This has also got Children of the Corn, which I think is what the cover here is referring to. And Children of the Corn was turned into a film as well, and I'm a big fan of the film Children of the Corn with Linda Hamilton. A lot of people don't like it. I see a lot of bad reviews for Children of the Corn, but I've always liked it, and it's a really good short story as well, and it spawned a whole franchise of films, which I'm probably not going to mount the same defence for. But it's a really good short story. This has also got two of my absolute favourite Stephen King short stories are in this. So Strawberry Spring and The Man Who Loved Flowers. And both of these stories are really interesting. They've got twist endings that you could probably see coming because they've been ripped off so much and copied by so many other writers and filmmakers. But when I read them, reading these, when I was 12, they were absolutely chilling because I wasn't expecting the ending that I got in either of those stories. And what I like about those stories, they're still two of my absolute favourite stories. What I like about them is they're kind of preoccupied with the ordinary. For most of the time that we're engaging with these stories, that they're talking about just general day-to-day things, and in the background something more sinister is happening. And then only at the end of the story do the strands connect and the clues kind of line up, and we find out what the stories are really about. And I just remember, Strawberry Spring particularly, I was genuinely terrified after I read that. I was really unsettled in a way that I don't think I've ever been unsettled by a horror book since. I tend to, I guess because I started reading horror at a young age, and because I think the world itself is terrifying most of the time, that horror, again, is horror can be that safe space where we play out fears, where we play out anxieties. Because you can't do that in the real world. The real world is terrifying enough. So horror can be a fun way to engage with themes and fears and concerns that we have about the world and about people and about any of the things that we're frightened of, any kind of natural fear that we have. But I remember that story in particular really got under my skin, and really, I remember lying awake after reading it and just feeling really unsettled. And much the same with The Man Who Loved Flowers as well. And in fact, when I was about 13 or 14, one of my first attempts at writing, outside of sort of writing stories for school, I wrote a screenplay adaptation for a short film of The Man Who Loved Flowers. It never got produced, but that was my first attempt at writing, and my first attempt at writing a script. And I had a lot of fun writing it as well. And I still think it would make a fantastic short film. I still think it's a really subtle story of kind of growing unease, growing tension, that's built on this accumulation of kind of random, everyday, just a character going about their everyday life, and then building to something that's a bit more unsettling, a bit more, again, it's the idea of, if you think of like the opening scenes of David Lynch's film Blue Velvet, where you have this kind of vision of idealized suburbia, where everything is white picket fences, everything is hissing summer lawns, everything is friendly custodians and friendly public servants, and the dogs and the wagging tails, and it's all very Norman Rockwell almost. It's all idealized Americana, and then suddenly there's this shift in tone, and the camera goes deep into the grass, deep into the undergrowth, and within the undergrowth there's a severed human ear, and it's that idea manifest in a short story. This idea of a guy who's just out and about, he's buying flowers, he's enjoying the hot summer's day, he's watching children play stickball. It's all of this idealized Americana, all this idealized American innocence, but underneath it all there is this darkness, there is this unsettling aspect to this character, and that fear that everybody out there, anyone you meet, could be potentially dangerous. Anybody could be hiding these potentially dark secrets, which is more terrifying than anything. It's more terrifying than any kind of masked killer or you think of the most violent, terrifying horror film you've ever seen. That quiet horror, that quiet contained horror is far more terrifying. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about this book, Night Shift, by Stephen King, which is one of the oldest books that I own, in terms of the fact that I've had it for a long time, and the fact that it was my mum's book and that she's had it for a long time as well. I have a lot of older books, but I bought them myself as sort of second-hand or used books, vintage books that I bought myself, which are much older. But this is one that has been in my family, at least, since my mum probably bought it before I was born, because she probably bought it when it was new. And it's a treasured book because of that, because it speaks to the kind of the symbolic passing the baton between generations, between my mum being a huge horror fan, passing the baton down to me as a huge horror fan, and also the fact that my grandma was a huge horror fan as well, and she loved Hammer horror films, and she loved Christopher Lee, and she would show my mum when my mum was very young. My grandma would say, we have to watch this film, and it would be The Scars of Dracula, or it would be Flesh for Frankenstein, and that there's that generational passing of the baton from parent to child, of introducing your children to the things that you liked, and then they become a kind of intrinsic part of who they are as readers and who they are as artists and who they are as people. So this is a treasured book in that sense because of that connection with my mum. But it's also an important book because I read it so many times when I was growing up, and it had such a profound influence on the type of books that I read and the type of stories that I write as an adult. And so that is Night Shift by Stephen King.